Moving on now to politics, what we do here on Sunday nights, pro-Russian militia in eastern Ukraine are growing bolder by the day. Now we're hearing pro-Russian militia have seized the main television station. They say they want to turn it into a pro-Russian TV channel. Ukraine has yet to take a stand over whether it's police force or military that's doing this. And all this comes as the May 11th referendum date looms. That's the day separatists want to hold a popular vote on turning this eastern region of Ukraine into a Russian satellite state. Fox News political insiders are here to talk about this, and you can join in the conversation at Twitter, at Harris Faulkner, hashtag FRW, at FN Insiders. Doug Schoen, former pollster for President Bill Clinton, is in tonight for John LeBoutillier is Ed Rollins, former White House political director and deputy chief of staff for President Reagan. And rejoining us from Rome now, Pat Caddell, a former pollster for President Jimmy Carter. All three are Fox News contributors. Ed, I'm going to start with you. Is America getting it right in terms of how we are pressing, the White House is pressing for more sanctions?
Well, we need more sanction. I mean, at the end of the day here, we have to make sure that our allies are going to basically back us up. You don't want to make it one-on-one. This is going to be a long, hard, drawn-out battle, and we can put tough sanctions on them, as we did in Iran, and put some real economic chaos there. But it's really not our fight. It's really Europe's fight, and Europe basically has to be there with us.
Doug?
Well, I agree partially with that. I think it is everyone's fight. But ultimately, we have to do something we haven't done, which is to show leadership. I agree with Ed that we have to expand the sanctions, but we also have to understand that unless there is a tough policy where America provides leadership, the Russians will go further into eastern Ukraine and try to take the whole region.
Before I go to Pat, I want to put this up, if we could run this now, from Senator Bob Corker of Tennessee, what he has to say about the situation. And there are some lawmakers who just simply are not mincing words. Let's watch.
Again, these sanctions on individuals are not having it's not creating the kind of pain within Russia that will cause Putin to change his behavior.
Pat Caddell, what will change things?
Well, I think, first of all, we've been generally a dollar late, a day short, and a dollar short, day late, dollar short. But, I was at a dinner with on Friday night with the former president of Poland and the head of Solidarity, Lech Walesa, spoke and talked about it, was asked about the Ukraine, and he had an interesting statement that I think affects all about American foreign policy and with Europe, which is, he said, you know, if the superpower, the United States, does not want to assert its moral authority to lead, then share it with Poland. We will show them how you do it. And I think that that's interesting because there was a clear sense that we are not leading, and the Europeans have, remember, a lot of pressures going on energy-wise. The Germans have a huge economic stake, as even the English do financially with Russia. And yet at the same time, as we have said over and over on Political Insiders, it's very predictable, and Doug is right. Putin is bound and determined to try to dismantle the Ukraine.
You know,
an independent state.
I want to go to Twitter now. Scott Muchet, I think is how you say it, says, sad to see Putin emboldened by Obama and Europe's lack of leadership. Why couldn't we at least send weapons? Hashtag consequences. Ed?
Once you start getting in with weapons, then the next thing is you send men to train the weapons. We've done that too many times. There's plenty of weapons there on both sides. I think it's just whether or not the Ukraine has the will to stand up and fight off this potential. It is a powder keg. It could explode at any given time. I think the bottom line here is Putin is driving this agenda, and unless he sees some strong opposition, he's going to, from us and others, that he's going to continue.
So what is down the road? Because what we're looking at, the sanctions have kind of a long-term effect,
Sure.
right, Doug? Because I've heard you say that. So there are people tonight, though, who are quite frightened by what they've seen. I mean, we saw Russian jets fly in and violate airspace
Correct.
of Ukraine on Friday. So what's the short-term plan?
Well, we don't have a short-term plan, and we have to be fair about that. And since Vladimir Putin, as Ed suggests, only responds to pressure, he believes he can either dismantle Ukraine, neutralize it, or otherwise destabilize the country in advance of the May 25th presidential elections. It's all, Harris, to the ill for the United States, and we have to put sanctions on the banking system and on their whole economic and political elite, not just of 16 or 17 people.
From Twitter, Pat, why is providing Ukraine with military aid a bad idea? William Young wants to know that.
Well, I understand the danger of slippery slopes, but I do think we should be sending something more than MREs, meals ready to eat, to the Ukrainian forces. I think we needed a stronger show of what we would support. I think the Ukrainians have to act. But I tell you, this is several months of dawdling around and convincing Putin, as I've said before, that he can push Obama around, that he's taken Obama's measure and he thinks that basically he's a weakling. And so far, that's what we've been. We've talked a lot. As Doug just said, you've got to put on sanctions that hurt Russia economically and to cause them to pause, not to simply take out a couple of individuals, which has no effect.
You know what's interesting?
And give up talking about it.
The president is spending quite a bit of time in Asia right now,
Right.
and we've been told not to expect too much of foreign policy to be changed or made out of this trip. It's more of a PR thing to show U.S. commitment to that region, according to the White House
Right.
statement that we've received. But Ukraine keeps coming up.
Well, look, the world does not exist in isolation. The great mistake the president made was drawing a red line in Syria and then letting it go. The Russians saw it, Putin saw it, and in Asia, what's happening now is the Japanese ask a blunt question. If you won't respect your treaty obligations vis-a-vis Ukraine, will you respect them vis-a-vis us if the Chinese attack?
Well, the
Interesting.
president was very forceful on that, and he said he would. He said he'd defend the rock, as he called it, which was probably a mistake.
Do you believe him, Ed?
Being perfectly honest, I think the important thing here is that the Chinese believe him, because that's.
Do they?
I don't think so. I think exactly.
Exactly.
But at least he said
Nobody
it.
does.
Dave Ness Dave Ness Jr. on Twitter says, and he's going to get us to segue to our next topic here. Ukraine has weapons. Something is keeping the Russians at bay. We did send the CIA, Dave Ness Jr. on Twitter. So it's interesting. At least some people are saying that it looks like we've done all we can do. Real quick, Pat, your thought?
No, I don't think we've done all we can do. I think that we should have been stronger in the first instance, and I think the president needed to lead and convince the Europeans, as I said, who are under particular threat. We have not even strategically understood the importance of the energy we have and how we should be in planning long term, so the Europeans are not vulnerable to the Russians. But we have other things to do. But as Doug suggests, this is around the world. And anyone who believes the Chinese take the Americans seriously after Syria, after Egypt, and now Ukraine, they're smoking something.
It's going to be tough to move on from Ukraine because Twitter is a Twitter with it right now. But we want to talk about the Keystone pipeline now. And this union boss who's upset with President Obama because he feels like this indecision process is putting jobs in jeopardy. What's your first response, Ed?
Well, first of all, he's absolutely right. And I think there's a lot of other AFL-CIOs who may not be speaking, presidents who may not be speaking out, but they're very unhappy about this. The president clearly made a political decision in which he was more concerned about the environmentalists than he was about jobs and labor movement. Keystone is a very vital thing to us for our energy, long-term energy. It'd be a perfect time to basically approve this thing. The message to the Russians and everybody else was, we're going to be energy independent. We're going to basically provide services to the rest of the world.
It's interesting. We can barely have a conversation these days without somebody mentioning Russia.
Right.
I mean, that came up with Keystone just now.
Yeah, and this is an interdependent world, and the fact that environmentalists of the Democratic Party and one big donor, Tom Steyer, effectively have a veto over what I think Ed and Pat and I all agree is sound public policy is very, very sad and detrimental to the interests of the United States.
Pat Caddell, Gene Klim writes on Twitter, Keystone is an example of corruption in both political parties.
Yeah, well, it is an example of corruption. You have one billionaire who threatening to put up $100 million, who represents a very elite and somewhat extreme environmentalist, saying, I don't want Keystone. The president, Obama has decided, just like he's done in healthcare, politically delay things to keep his constituencies and candidates happy. And it basically caved. This thing about indecision has been going on, and basically what he is Ed said, is trading jobs for their support, and they have the biggest clout. When a billionaire can threaten to buy the government's actions on what is best for the United States of America, politics is corrupt. And I can point equally to the Republican Party, too. And by the way, it seems that Mr. Steyer, who claims to be a pure heart, has some business interest in this, as we found in the Wall Street Journal, to suggest he's also feathering his nest.
Interesting. Your response, Ed?
My response, I mean, the more important issue here is Canada is one of our closest allies. They want us to have this energy. We've had pipelines. We've been studying this thing to death. The State Department's report came out, said it's environmentally perfect, and we should have it done.
You know, you bring up Canada. Do we have that Canadian ambassador? Can we see that? Let's watch this together.
We were very disappointed. We were hoping that the approval would come through so that we could start in the construction season to have employ hard hats instead of just having a discussion going on, an ongoing discussion. So by denying and delaying the pipeline, we have less hard hats working in the U.S. and Canada. We have more oil now coming down to the United States on rail. Every day there's more oil on rail.
Interesting. And that was the Ambassador Gary Dewar. He was on this morning with our own Maria Bartiromo. You're shaking your head yes.
Yeah, I think it's obvious the case the ambassador is making. It's energy independence, it's jobs, it insulates ourselves from pressures overseas. I mean, Ed, we were talking before about how the Canadians have threatened to do a deal with the Chinese if we don't do the pipeline. None of this makes any sense.
It's also safety. There's always a chance of a train going off the track. It happens every day. Pipeline safety is high priority, and it's one of the best ways to ship oil, gas, what have you.
You know what's interesting? I hear you and Pat Caddell, who are Democrats as far as I know.
We are.
But you're not supporting the president on this at all, Pat.
Well, no, because I happen to think that the issue of both energy independence, our support of our ally Canada, what it affects us, our ability to develop energy exports, for instance, to Europe, which affects Russians, and most of all, affecting American growth and jobs. Like, I agree with the unions, who basically have supported the president and got nothing for it because they're not part of what I believe that super elitist and overly indulgent arrogance of certain people at the elite level of the Democratic Party. And it's all not to the benefit of the United States.
What happens politically, real quickly, gentlemen, if the president just, because you know what happens if you don't make a decision, life decides for you. What happens if this just doesn't get decided on?
Well, ultimately, it will not happen if it's not decided. And the more time we waste, the more likely it is that it doesn't happen. That, like Nebraska, which has rerouted the pipeline because of some local court issues. Harris, this is all contrary to American interests, contrary to policy making, makes us look weak and impotent overseas.
Wow.
And the Canadians have made it clear they're going to sell this to China if we don't basically come forward on this.
And the president is in Asia. Very interesting.
Failing to negotiate a trade deal.
All right. I want to go back out to Pat Caddell, who's joining us tonight from Vatican City. You know, what we were talking about is just kind of this perception of America around the world. And I want to get your final thoughts on that, because you've got the president in Asia, and Ed Rollins just brought up, you know, the Canadians could take the Keystone pipeline deal and do a deal with China. You think that's coming up while the president's in Asia, Pat?
Well, I don't know if it's coming up while he's in Asia, but I think it's destined as we continue to lay this. Look, today we celebrated what moral leadership can do in the world. And unfortunately in our politics, whether it's the Republican leadership on Benghazi, the president on foreign policy and the Keystone pipeline, we have a moral desert when it comes to moral leadership in our political system.
Jonathan Davis says on Twitter,
interesting contrast.
Doug, we do not need to be moral world leaders. That's absurd.
Oh, yes, we do. We are the greatest nation in the world. We stand for enduring values of liberty, freedom, and with tomorrow being Holocaust Remembrance Day, there is a higher purpose. We stand for it, and unless we provide leadership, the whole world suffers.
Ed Rollins, final thoughts tonight.
Well, I think the three of us, we're all Americans. We're not partisan Republicans and Democrats only. No one wants our president to fail. We want our president and our government to succeed. It's failing, though, and I think to a certain extent the rest of the world sees a lack of leadership, and that's basically a position of weakness.
And Pat, on what you said, Independent 2 on Twitter says, well said, Pat. Gentlemen, thank you all for being here. Ed, thanks for sitting in for John LeBoutillier. And you can continue the conversation with the Fox News political insiders on Twitter @FN Insiders.